Hello everyone, my name is Kera Beskin. Today in this short 10-minute video training, I'll be going over some tips and tricks for successful focus group moderation. So by the end of this training, you should be able to explain the characteristics of a good focus group moderator, describe why moderation is essential to qualitative research, and identify several tips and tricks. And it's important to remember that this is specific for focus group moderation, so a small group, typically around 6 to 10. However, of course, there's some crossover for informational interviewing or qualitative interviewing, one-on-one, as shown in the picture. And so the resource that I'll be quoting a lot today, and one of my personal favorites, is this book, Qualitative Methods in Public Health, a Field Guide for Applied Research. So if you're a master's student and you're going to be doing a capstone that's really qualitative heavy, I really encourage you to check out this book. So firstly, characteristics of a good focus group moderator is to have open, positive, nonverbal body language. You'll want to have confident, upright posture and not crossing your arms, which can look standoffish. And you'll want to make it clear with your eyes and your body language that you're listening closely. In your mind, you're probably going to be thinking rapid fire of like, should I follow up on what that person just said? Should I move the conversation forward? Has that person begun to dominate the conversation? Should I intervene? But it's important to not feel lost in your thoughts, but to be there in that moment and to not look down at your script rather than at the participants. And you should also be able to feel at ease and put others at ease. People will be more likely to share if they feel comfortable and convey a warmth and empathy and non-judgment. This is particularly true if you're talking about really difficult subjects and things that are really value-laden, which happens all the time in health. And then also, you should be able to interpret and explore what people are talking about in light of the research problem. And so this one is important because people will share really interesting things and you don't have time to follow up on everything that everyone says. But people will say really interesting things that you'll want to delve deeper into. It's important to follow the research problem. What do you think is most important for your research question? Oh, and I forgot one, have a genuine interest and enthusiasm for the topic. If you're not interested, why should anyone else be? I like to think about moderation a bit like a rodeo. So you have no idea what the participants are going to say, but it's up to you to help them navigate this conversation. So you make sure it stays on topic, but it's also flexible enough that it can roam around and people can talk about subjects that actually interest them. So moderation is key to getting good data. If you are a skilled moderator, you can create rich, interesting, really detailed, nuanced accounts of lived experiences. Or on the other hand, you could create really rote, boring, bland, dry responses that just barely skim the surface of the topic, which is not what we want. So a skilled moderator makes all of the difference because what we're interested in is in an insider's view of how people view their lives and how they see themselves. And so that's often how I begin my focus group. That's a tip number one for you, is that I frame the issue that like people are experts on their own bodies and their own lived experiences, and that's the only thing that we're interested in a focus group. So there's no right or wrong answers, and people are just to share their story. And a lot of times people hear about focus group moderation and they think, well, it's just a conversation. How special is a conversation? We have these every day. But it's important to remember that this knowledge, this insider knowledge you're gaining from people can help inform and create culturally sensitive and appropriate health education programs, marketing campaigns, and even what we're measuring. So lastly, let's move to the tips and tricks. So one of mine that I like to do is to Of course, after you've done introductions and you've introduced the study and you've gone through the consent procedures, I like to norm the conversation, or you set up a bit of ground rules. Sometimes I print them off and have them on the table. People tend to like structure. It makes them feel safe. And so some of these norms I'm talking about is not interrupting others, not judging others. Sometimes we call it don't yuck someone else's yum if you're working with young kids. Also, sometimes we call it, there's another one called vagus rules. What happens in the focus group, and I've talked about the focus group, stays within the focus group. Another one that's common is step up, step back, which you have people think about if they're extroverted or introverted. If they're extroverted, you have them think about not answering every question, to really listen and see if they're dominating the conversation and for them to hold back. And if they're introverted, to push themselves to come forward, because we want all voices to share equally. All voices are equally as important in the conversation. Secondly, I really encourage you to be comfortable with the interview guide. Oftentimes, a semi-structured interview guide for a focus group will be 8 questions for a 2-hour discussion, or simply 8 topics for you to talk about. And that can seem really scary to a new focus group moderator. Someone might think, how am I supposed to keep this conversation going for 2 hours on these 8 questions? But you are to probe, probe, probe. Ask the question, someone will say something, and that will kick off a conversation. So really try to probe to get the why underneath someone's statement or assumption. Think about like what drives that statement. You'll want to not just ask the questions in the order that they're on the focus group guide. Have the people feel like they're leading the conversation, not this arbitrary piece of paper that's in front of you. And also, you might as well be just giving a survey. If you just answer question 1, let me ask the group. Question 2, let me ask the group. But a focus group that I did, it began with anatomy questions, and people began thinking about their childhood, how they learned about anatomy, health classes, and so they started talking about learning and family dynamics, and that was at the very end of my focus group guide. So I just jumped to the end, came back, jumped back and forth. It's totally fine. It's more appropriate to follow the conversation where it leads naturally. Thirdly, don't be afraid of silence. So use the silent probe. And that can be done with eyes, by making eye contact with someone, or smiling or nodding in their direction. Or oftentimes it can just be asking a question and waiting. And I promise you, silence is uncomfortable for people, and they will say something, even if it's just to have you repeat the question or rephrase the question. But often in focus groups, especially around health topics, we're asking them deep, heavy subjects that people might not think about on a daily basis. So give them time to really think. It's okay to have some silence in your focus group. Next, encourage equal participation. So encourage quieter members to contribute. You can do that in a variety of ways. Like I said, just using your body language to really let people know that they're not hiding in this conversation. You expect to hear from them. You can also do it in a more direct approach of like, for this next question, I haven't heard from Susie and Michael yet, so I'd love for you to start the conversation if you don't mind. Or you don't even have to call out their names. You could just say something like, I'd like to hear from the members that haven't spoken as much. And lastly, this is really common in health topics because you're a health researcher. That's typically how you introduce yourself, that you're at the University of Illinois, you're a health researcher, is to deflect questions asked directly to you. People will ask, well, where is the bladder in the body? Or what do you think? Or is that right? What do doctors say? What's medically correct? And it's important to not set yourself up as the subject matter expert. And so what I like to do is just flip it around and ask the room and say, that's a really great question. I'm wondering what everyone else in this room is thinking, or I'd love to hear from all of you. So lastly, some common pitfalls to avoid. Avoid just asking why. You can risk sounding a bit like a 2-year-old, or it does sound a little bit rude. So add some context or add some fluff around that question to really soften it so it's not so direct. Also, I feel like this next one is common for new researchers, especially if you're not the PI. Don't apologize for the question. And what I mean by that is someone saying like, oh, we already talked about this, but I have to ask it anyways. Or I don't really know what the researcher is going for here, but, and then you ask the question. Just be confident. Assume the questions are your own questions. Of course, you can, typically PIs allow you to rephrase questions so they feel naturally, if you're working for someone else, naturally in your own voice. Avoid leading questions like, what problems do you have with your bladder? Which assumes that it is normal and everyone has problems with their bladder. So if someone in the focus group doesn't have problems, they suddenly feel strange or feel left out. And it's clear where I want the conversation to go. And lastly, avoid test-like questions. This is really common in healthcare as well, since often people feel like there is a right or wrong answer. For example, like what age should you start introducing solid foods? So that feels like there is a correct answer, and mothers in the focus group might feel bad if they don't know the right answer. So have more open-ended questions that are friendly. There's no right or wrong answer, which is how you set up a focus group conversation. So here are my resources, that wonderful book again. There are tons of articles on PubMed. Here's one of my favorites. And acknowledgements, thank you for all of the doctors who allowed me to work on their studies when I was in grad school. So thank you so much. I hope you learned a lot about focus group moderation.